So, we have been hearing in the past few weeks from the book of Luke specifically how Jesus was stressing how important everybody is, the value of each individual, and that often people that seemed unimportant or unlovable or maybe even bad were people that Jesus was pursuing and he was valuing them. And we called this the Great Reversal. And the last 2 weeks we saw a verse from Luke 13 and a verse from Luke 14. From Luke 13, those who are last will be first, and the first will be last. And Luke 14, all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I want to talk today about kind of that and the flip side of the coin, but this idea that Scripture continually gives us a message about how really low we should prioritize having glory and applause on this side of heaven. From Galatians 1, this is Paul writing. Do you think I care about the approval of men or about the approval of God? Do you think I'm on a mission to please people? If I'm still spinning my wheels trying to please men, then there is no way I could be a servant of the Anointed One, the liberating King. And then in John 5:44, this is why it's hard to see how true faith is even possible for you. You are consumed by the approval of other men, longing to look good in their eyes, and yet you disregard the approval of the one true God. And I've been thinking about this because it's graduation season, and I was a high school teacher for 20 years, did some teaching in college for a little bit, had 3 boys now go through that graduation ceremony and open house, and suddenly life is in front of them. And it's pretty typical in a graduation commencement speech to hear something about how amazing your life is going to be and how awesome the things you're going to do. And it's typically valued by something that culture says will make your life amazing or valuable or be really incredible. A popular book to read is Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. Anybody familiar with this? And one of the things I really like about that book is like, oh, the places you'll go, it's super high on the mountaintop, and then it's like, except when it's not, and it's down in the valley. And it does a nice job showing both sides. But at the end, your conclusion is still like, you're going to move mountains. And the implication is mountains such that people will applaud you, you'll be successful, you'll be popular at the end of the day. I don't mean to dismiss Oh, the Places You'll Go, because I love that book. But the conclusion is, I think, more culturally oriented than it is kingdom oriented, because I'm not sure that's always the best message to send to graduates. And now I'm not just talking to those of you who have graduated this year or recently. This is for all of us. It's just, I think, a timeless thing that's worth talking about. It's just rare that you hear a message that one of the most important places that you will go is being a good friend, or volunteering to help people in poverty, or being a good parent, or being a good employee or employer. Maybe it's leading a small group at church, or being part of Big Brother, Big Sister. Maybe it's babysitting kids for overwhelmed parents. Maybe it's just offering free help in your area of your expertise, and it might just be as simple as being kind. And you go to any of those places, those are as magical, I dare say, as many other things that we think about. Because it turns out there are mountains that need to be moved in people's lives. And all those things I just mentioned are tools that we can use to help do that. And the empire might not think it's important, but I promise you that the kingdom does. One of the books of the Bible that fascinates me is the book of Judges. And once we get through the life of Jesus and then the book of Acts, it would be fun to start going through the Old Testament. But at the rate we're going, I will be retired before we're done with the life of Jesus. I'm not planning on it. But Judges shows the cycle of God's faithfulness over and over to very unfaithful people. And one of the things I think Judges intends to do is give us some revelation about how God intends us to think of our lives. So some of it can be seen in the pattern of the failure of Israel. You kind of learn from history so you don't repeat it. But there's some other things that are a little more subtle that I think are equally important. Now, what we're going to read today from Judges, it's Old Testament. Old Testament can be confusing and off-putting and raise a lot of questions. This is why I hope we'll eventually get to doing more of a series of that. But for our purposes today, we're just going to read some stuff about some of the judges as we talk about priorities in life and self-worth and value and meaning in the kingdom. We're going to start in Judges 3. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. And he gave them a deliverer, Ehud. The Israelites sent him with a tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about 1.5 feet long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way the men who carried it. And at the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, Quiet, and all his attendants left him. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his summer palace and said, I have a message from God for you. And as the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. You didn't expect this passage this morning. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. And then Ehud went out to the porch, and he shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. While the servants assumed Eglon was taking his good old time in the bathroom, that's not in the King James, that's my paraphrase. Ehud got away. He passed by the idols and escaped to Seirah. And when he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. Follow me, he ordered, for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands. So they followed him down, and taking possession of the ford of the Jordan that led to Moab, they allowed no one to cross over. And at that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not a man escaped. And that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. Okay, Old Testament, it's violence. We could talk about this in Message Plus if we'd like to. I don't want us to distract from where we're going. So 3 cheers for Ehud. We get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 good paragraphs, an exciting story. Ehud's the man. All right, here's the next verse. After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. Okay, now, here's some context. This was Judges 3. In Judges 4 and 5, the judge Deborah is going to get 2 chapters and a whole song. And in the song, Shamgar is going to kind of get a shout out, but that's the only other thing you hear about him. Judges 6 to 8, Gideon's going to get 3 chapters. Judges 9, Abimelech gets a whole chapter, and Abimelech's the guy who made this terrible oath to God that he was going to sacrifice the first thing that came out of the house when he got home, and it was his daughter, and he did it. And he gets a whole chapter. Judges 13 to 16, he got a chapter. Judges 11 and 12, Jephthah gets 2 chapters, and he's the guy who killed his daughter. Abimelech, I was wrong about who he killed. He killed his brothers. Judges 13 to 16, Samson gets 4 chapters, and if you're familiar with Samson, I don't think we generally call him a role model. And now back to Judges 3. Shamgar gets 1 verse that sounds almost like you should read it with a yawn, like, he too saved Israel. And then we get to Judges 10, verses 1 to 5. We get a similar situation. There was a man of Issachar, Tola, son of Puah, the son of Dodo, who rose to save Israel. He lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel 23 years, and then he died, and he was buried in Shamir. He was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. So Tola rises to save Israel. Awesome. Apparently he does. It doesn't really say, but he must have done something to save Israel. And the next guy has a lot of donkeys. And that's all we really learn about them. But the beginning of Judges said this: whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. So, now we're getting to my point. If you were a judge at all, God had raised you up himself. He had appointed you for the deliverance of Israel. He was with you as long as you lived. And some of them get their whole story recorded for the world. They get multiple chapters and songs, even if they were kind of terrible people on the side. And some of them get what we would be the equivalent today to us like retiring and getting a nod and getting a watch. And let's say you're Shamgar. It says he saved the nation by killing 600 enemies with what boiled down to a big stick with a pointy end. And he kind of gets an attaboy, like, hey, well done, Shamgar, you too saved Israel. Which feels to me like giving the history of the NBA and saying, and Michael Jordan also played basketball. Or women's college basketball, Caitlin Clark too once played. Maybe you're discussing music and you're talking the history of everything, and you're like, Beethoven too was a composer. Taylor Swift also sang. Or you could say of Ohio State, they too had a football team. So Tola and Jair, they're raised up by God himself for such a time as that to deliver God's people. And all they get is they lived, they died, they had boys who rode donkeys, which seems like unnecessary trivia compared to all this other stuff that you're getting for other people. I think today, if people would be treated like that, they'd want to go on TV and say, I've been disrespected, I've been overlooked, because we're a culture that I think increasingly, especially with all we have in media, thinks we all kind of deserve this 15 minutes of fame, and if we do something really good, we ought to be famous for it, and everybody should applaud us. There's a guy named Ashley Brilliant who once said, all I ask of life is a constant and exaggerated sense of my own importance. And to whatever degree that's funny, I think it might reflect something about a tendency of the human condition. Like when we do things well, we really want to be noticed and to get applause. And I think biblical narratives of stories like this are pointing us toward kind of a hard truth in the Christian walk, and that sometimes God will raise us up and he'll use us mightily and will not be noticed and we'll never get the credit that we think we deserve. We'll functionally get, they too did a thing. And we'll know in our own spirit how hard it was, what a sacrifice it was, what it cost us, how important it was, and no one seems to notice, and then we have to wrestle with what do we do with that. I was reading an article called Unsung Heroes by Reva Pomerantz. This will update it a little bit from Oxcodes, and I was delighted when my husband bought a beautiful name plaque for our front door until I noticed the door. Years of fingerprints, remnants of gummy tape, stickers, and I don't even want to think about what else, had etched themselves onto the once white door. A quick glance from beautiful nameplate to horrifying door brought me to the only possible conclusion: clean the door. So 2 hours later, the door was sparkling white and the nameplate was handsomely ensconced in its center. And when my kids got up in the morning and saw the complete metamorphosis of the front door, they were, of course, awed. Look, Daddy, they told my husband, they cleaned the door. My husband told me of their reaction with some amusement. They cleaned the door? I practically yelled. They is me. I cleaned the door. What do they think? Magic fairies come while we're all asleep and clean the furniture, put away the toys, and bake the cookies? So in the grand scheme of door cleaning, I remain an unsung hero. Obviously, a much smaller example than saving Israel. But I think the principle is the same there. Like there's something that we did, that we took the time and it was valuable and it made a difference and we're just overlooked. And once again, I think we have this drive in us that we want to be noticed, that we want to stand out, we want to be somebody in the eyes of people, and that's usually by our own standards or something culture is telling us about what will make us matter. So, for example, have you ever played a sport and you're really struggling, but the rest of the team isn't, and the team's winning, and you have a hard time being excited because you personally aren't doing well? It's hard to get excited for the other people who are. Or you hear somebody share a testimony about what God has done in their lives, saved them from a particular sin or a tough circumstance, and everyone cheers them and applauds them. Maybe they get a book, they get a couple more speaking gigs, and they become really well known, and you're thinking, hey, that's my story too. Like, almost verbatim, that's what I did, and nobody is giving me attaboys and knows my story. Or there's a lot to feel good about in your life, but it's just not the kind of thing where you go, I was in a gang of cannibal human traffickers, and so you don't get the spotlight because it's those kind of big stories that get the stage. Maybe it's just something like this. I've struggled with really low self-esteem or self-loathing, and I think I'm finally starting to see myself as Jesus sees me. And it's hugely important, and it's life-changing to you, and it's life-changing to the people around you. It's changing how you are in every aspect of your life, and nobody knows. And I think there's two equally subtle and dangerous temptations. One is to think that you're just not important, and no one can benefit from learning what God has done in your life. And the other temptation is to think you're super important, and everyone should know what you've done in your life. And I think both of those extremes are toxic. Because in the bottom line, the only validation as followers of Jesus that matters to us in the end is the validation of God. I'm not saying it's not enjoyable to have other people validate you. And I really hope, by the way, this whole point is going to be about being good enough with what God thinks of us. But just in the last week, I've had several people who just validated me in ways that felt profound, in areas of my life that I was feeling pleased about. I didn't know if anybody noticed. And I just, out of the blue, it was, I think, 3 different people just said, hey, I really want you to know I see this in you. And it did feel really great. And this isn't what that sermon is about. So I want to note, validate others as often as you can. Make it uncomfortable. Find a couple people afterwards today and make it feel awkward and tell them really nice things about themselves. That'd be a good practice every Sunday. But at the end of the day, when we're trying to figure out what establishes our sense of value, of worth, of whether or not we're living meaningfully in the world, it's going to have to do with how God sees us. And how God sees us. Here is a passage from Matthew 6, 1 through 4. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they've received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And the point wasn't that they shouldn't do good deeds. And it wasn't that if they did them selfishly, they were going to hell or something. The point was, if you do something to get the applause of people, you'll get the applause of people, and that's it. Like, you got what you were looking for. But as followers of Jesus, we're not looking for that. We're looking for the applause of heaven. And the way we go about living our lives looks very different when all we're concerned about is that heaven sees what we're doing, and heaven affirms us. Someone once said, none are so empty as those who are full of themselves. And I think that's the idea. It'll actually become this addictive cycle where you'll just need more and more. That validation felt good, so now you have to get it again and again, and it's another kind of hit that becomes its own kind of dopamine charge. And next thing you know, I think it's what we call the rat race in some ways. You're just going after the applause over and over because you always stay empty. And it's just nothing compared to the rewards of the Father. I like this verse from 2 Timothy 4:17. This is Paul. The Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. I like that little tack on. Oh, by the way, also, I was delivered from the lion's mouth. What's the most important part of that passage? Through me, the message might be fully proclaimed and the Gentiles could hear it. That's the important part. Also, I was saved from lions. If that happened today, somebody would be on a talk show circuit and have a book and maybe a movie made about their life, and you'd hear a lot about the being saved from the lions, and they'd get celebrity status pretty quickly. But I just suspect Paul, like if someone brought that up, he'd be like, whatever, you know what I did? I proclaimed the message to the Gentiles so they could learn about Jesus. Yeah, it's just something which catches our eye to him in light of comparison to the gospel was a minor thing. And I have this feeling that Paul knew that a story that featured Paul being saved from lions was going to be a story about Paul. And Paul wanted the story to be about Jesus. I think the idea is if we're telling stories about how God has been at work in our life or the opportunities we have, if the spotlight ends up veering back on us, we've missed the point of telling the story. The point of the story is about Christ in us. In other words, think of it this way. It spotlights us when it's God who deserves it. And when Paul does talk about himself in the Bible, it's because his audience was caught up in this celebrity worship. And at one point, in 2 Corinthians 10 and 11, he basically goes, okay, if you're going to play this game and throw all your titles and your connections and stuff out, let's do it. And so he does it in a chapter. It's kind of hilarious to read because, like, yeah, if you're looking for importance, Paul's got everybody beat. And then Paul's like, that's irrelevant. I don't want to talk about it. Everybody settle down. Let's get back to what matters the most, which is talking about Jesus. We see this again in Philippians 4:22. All the saints send you greetings, especially those who belong to Caesar's household. People are converting in Caesar's household. Do you know who converted them? That would be Paul, who wrote this verse. He was in prison, and a lot of them start to convert. And Paul could have said, especially greetings from those I converted from Caesar's household in the midst of persecution. And all Paul says is those from Caesar's household send their greetings. Because once again, he didn't want the story to be about Paul. He wanted the story to be about Jesus. And so the question I have today is, and I've been thinking about that a lot this week, is, can I live my life with no regard for the glory and recognition of others, but with complete focus on faithfulness and obedience to Christ wherever he leads me? In other words, can I just be who God has called me to be and do what God has called me to do? And that's enough, knowing that I'm living my life with integrity and honesty as best I can before God. So are we willing to take the time to let God help us build our character, to address sin in our lives, our character flaws, maybe quirks that are hindering our relationship with other people? Are we willing to do the hard work of surrendering ourselves to Christ? Maybe it's getting into accountability. Maybe you need counseling. There's a whole lot of ways, a lot of tools God has given us to bring about maturity. Are we willing to do that even if no one notices? And it could be years of work. And the whole point is just to be a more mature person in Christ, whether or not anybody ever notices or ever cares. Are we willing to work really hard to be godly spouses and parents? And that means we set priorities in our time. We put the needs of our spouse and our kids in front of us. We steward what we have. Now, obviously, if you do this, your family will tell the difference, and they will thank you. But what if nobody knows how much work you've put into being a good mother or father? Or how much work you've put into being a Christ-like son or daughter? What if nobody knows what it has cost you to live with integrity in your own family, showing love and faithfulness and goodness and kindness? Is it enough that God knows? Can we go out of our way to volunteer, like here in the church, kids ministry, nursery, committee work, cleaning the building, volunteering in the community? Can we do it cheerfully if nobody notices and nobody applauds us and we never get a plaque or a day of recognition? And Lord knows, I hope we're the kind of community that does applaud and recognize. That's the kind thing to do. But if it doesn't happen, is that okay? Was it enough that we did it in response to something that God laid on our heart as a way to be present in our communities? Can we be broken and spilled out in the service of Christ for our spouses, our kids, our parents, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers? Can we do it even if the only time we hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," is on the other side of the grave? Do we have to hear it now to keep going? Or is the affirmation of Christ enough? And I don't know, maybe your life will be written in lights. And if it is, and if it was God who wants your story known, then embrace those lights and tell your story to the glory of God. It's not like Deborah and Gideon were bad people because they got chapters and songs. I'm just saying, are we okay if that's not what happens? And maybe the only record of our life is she too, he too, did that thing, and nobody knows. So maybe she too wrestled with addictions or overcame addictions. Maybe that'll be the thing people will say about you, and it's just 5 words, and it'll never capture the journey that was, and the glorious things God did in your life, and the cost that you had, But that'll be okay because Jesus sees it and Jesus knows. Maybe he too had a family. It's the most that will register with people. And here on Father's Day, you dads, they'll never know the cost it was to be a godly father. They'll never know, but it'll be okay because Jesus knows. And maybe she too overcame a difficult past, as the most people will know about you. And it won't do justice to your pain, and it won't do justice to the long process of healing. It won't do justice to the miraculous work that God has done in you, but that'll be okay because Jesus sees it. And maybe they too were in ministry, as all people will note about you, and it won't reflect the years of your life being broken and spilled out, helping those who so desperately need Jesus. 5 words for a lifetime, and that'll be okay because Jesus sees you. And maybe she too got out of bed yet again and did the next thing right, is your legacy. And you think, oh, my life, what a failure that is. But actually, maybe that's profound by kingdom standards. That God gave you the strength and the grace day after day and provided for you. And no one will know how hard each day was and how much it cost you. But Jesus does. And maybe people will say, you know what, they too didn't know what to do with their life, but they knew how to live each day well. Maybe that resonates with you. And maybe you're heroic in your daily faithfulness, and no one else knows what it cost you. The time you spend in prayer, struggling with your emotions, comparing yourself to others, all the swirl of all that, no one will know, but Jesus knows. And maybe he too was a good friend, will be the primary eulogy at the end of your life. And that short sentence captures a lifetime of kingdom witness that the Holy Spirit used to move mountains in people's lives. Because maybe one of the places you'll go is just to the side of other people. And it's profound, and it ripples through eternity. So in the kingdom of heaven, we have a heavenly Father who's waiting for the day when we enter into his presence. And on that day, millions of unsung heroes will hear, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your reward. Lord, may we be free to be at peace in who you have made us to be and what you have called us to do. May we be content being known and loved and valued in your eyes. May that be where our sense of self-worth, our sense of our sense of self-worth, may that be enough. May your grace be sufficient. Well, your grace is. May we realize that. And the Lord, I pray, meanwhile, that we become a community of people who keep an eye out for unsung heroes and unsung moments, that we build relationships such that we are able to see what you are doing in people's lives and how things are changing. And may we be people who are quick to validate, to affirm, to applaud each other so that we are encouraged by the group of people that we're in this life. So Lord, help us be that kind of community. But at the end of the day, may we all experience and embrace the profound worth we have because you love us. And that is enough. Amen. All right, thank you for joining us and putting up with all the glitches this morning. Message Plus will start at 11:15. Kids stuff continues until 12 o'clock. We have a